For the longest time, Nintendo was the king of handhelds. Not only did they have a string of great systems with fantastic libraries, they had virtually no competition. That is, until 2004. Nintendo had unveiled their exciting follow-up to the Game Boy Advance, the DS, but they would be sent home quaking in their boots at the reveal of the Gizmondo. The Gizmondo is an odd system. It was actually produced by a tech startup called Tiger Telematics, who previously specialized in GPS units or something. They created a UK-based subsidiary called the Gizmondo Company to produce a handheld capable of going toe-to-toe with giants like Nintendo or the Nokia N-Gage. They didn't have the IPs or the brand recognition to compete, so they decided to leverage their history in tech by packing the unit with all sorts of features. Within its ugly little chassis lies a GPS, multimedia player, SD card reader, Bluetooth, a camera, and even a SIM card to make phone calls and text messages. Mind you, this thing started development in 2003. Forget smartphones, people were still transitioning off pagers. This was an impressive feature set, and it blew the GBA out of the water at the time. In the tech world, Gizmondo was poised to become the next big thing. They threw lavish parties speckled with celebrities. They got sponsorships from Formula One racers. They had weird ads. They were raking in money by the truckload. When investors saw the Gizmondo, they saw a golden ticket to the future. When the actual gaming audience saw it, they saw a weird little rubber thing with no games they'd actually want to play. That was twice as expensive as their competitors. Oh yeah, so the Nintendo DS, which would be released around the same time, launched at $150. The PSP, a much more powerful system, launched at $250 a year later. The Gizmondo was $400.
Cool.
To add insult to injury, just weeks before its European launch, they announced that a second widescreen variant would be coming sometime later. So as a consumer, you have two choices. You can buy the $400 handheld that's packed with 100 features you don't need, that's going to have an improved version coming soon, which will inevitably drive the price down. Or you can pay a third of that and get access to a guaranteed library of games from one of the oldest names in the industry. Their biggest game was called Sticky Balls. Oh, I almost forgot to mention, they had a cheaper model with a feature called Smart Ads, which were just advertisements. And it retailed at $250 US. Basically, a PSP with no games and mandatory ad breaks. So this thing flopped hard, to no one's surprise. A classic case of some jabronis trying to break into an industry that they didn't understand, choosing flash over substance, and crashing straight into cold, hard reality. Hey, speaking of crashes, here's a fun, weird fact. One of the CEOs of the company was involved in this crazy car crash in Malibu, California. He was driving this disgustingly expensive limited-run Ferrari Enzo, going almost 200 miles an hour or something, and he swung into a telephone pole so hard the car split in half. Like, holy shit, look at these pictures. A local deputy arrived on the scene and just couldn't believe his eyes. Here's this guy with a thick Swedish accent, his name is Stefan Eriksson, standing there with another guy sitting on the road, and he's like, oh my god, what happened here? So this dude starts telling him about it, and the story's, hang on. The story's a little weird, actually. Eriksson says that there were actually two cars. He was a passenger in the Ferrari, and this other fellow was a passenger in a Mercedes. The Mercedes pulled over, and this dude Trevor Carney jumps out. The driver speeds off for some reason. Meanwhile, according to him, the Ferrari was being driven by a guy named Dietrich, who had fled into the hills. Supposedly, the emergency call didn't even come from either of them. It was from a random passerby who had already left the site. Then out of nowhere, Eriksson pulls out a police badge and says that he's a member of an anti-terrorism unit in Southern California? Before the deputy can get a handle on the situation, 2 unmarked cars arrive at the scene. 2 guys jump out and claim to be Homeland Security. They ask to speak with Eriksson privately, but the deputy doesn't let them out of his sight. Eriksson is given a breathalyzer test and gets a score of .09. The legal limit in California is .08, making this a DUI. Against all reason, the officer lets everybody go, but something's wrong. The next morning, they get a call. Carney's story about calling the police with someone else's phone is true. It's the Good Samaritan from yesterday. He's telling them that Carney had hopped into his car to dial 911, and now, under the same seat, he'd discovered a fully loaded magazine for a handgun. Stefan Eriksson was born in 1961 in Sweden. By age 19, he had a criminal record, but it wasn't for small-time drug dealing or getting into fights. No, his first arrest was for the coordinated robbery of a bank van in 1981. It wasn't an isolated incident, he was just getting started. After his release, he would recruit a number of cohorts to his criminal operations in and around the city of Uppsala. Whatever crimes you can think of, he organized. Robberies, drug trafficking, kidnapping, but central to these, debt collection. Eriksson knew that if you really wanted to play the game, you had to get into business. Find vulnerable people, offer them some cash to get them through the short term, then come collecting, with interest. One story involves him and his boys breaking into a debtor's apartment. When they found only his friend at home, they pressed him for his roommate's location, but he had nothing. So they knocked out his teeth, threatened to cut his fingers off, and pointed a gun down his throat. When it came time to testify, the head witness was targeted in 2 separate bomb attacks. This was just a day's work, and soon his reputation preceded him. Stories swirl about police tracking the gang, watching them pick people up in a car, drive around town for an hour, then drop them off. When they would go to ask the passengers how they knew those men, they would be trembling, too scared to speak. Any time Eriksson was standing trial, every witness miraculously failed to remember anything about him. In a Wired article from 2006, Uppsalan law enforcement veteran Lars Nyland said of Eriksson, quote, "He might have been the smartest criminal I've ever encountered, but as smart as he was, being noticed meant more to him than staying out of jail." This was his Achilles heel. For as impenetrable as the rest of his operation was, Eriksson could not help but indulge his ego. He wore flashy jewelry and drove expensive cars around town. He was just incapable of keeping a low profile, compelled to flaunt his wealth and skirting of the law. That Achilles heel would be struck in 1993, when what might have been his biggest gambit collapsed under him. The Uppsala Mafia, as they were known, were caught attempting to defraud a Swedish bank of an equivalent $3.5 million. The plan was to distribute the money, but authorities intercepted them, and when Eriksson was arrested in relation to the crimes, he was carrying an equivalent $65,000 on him. He just had to have that cash to flash. Stefan Eriksson was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but only served 6. Is there any reform in prison? Of course not. This was just going to school. Upon his release in 2000, Eriksson contacted an old associate of his, Carl Freer. When they met in the late 80s, Freer was a nightclub manager, but now he was a tech entrepreneur. Freer had formed a company called Eagle Eye Scandinavian to distribute GPS units internationally. Enter Floor Decor, a Florida-based company who made floor coverings. Freer had gotten them to agree to a deal in which they'd acquire Eagle Eye Scandinavian. Now, on paper, this doesn't make any sense. Why would a small flooring company in the US have any interest in a Scandinavian GPS distributor?
Well,
We're going to enter the realm of speculation here, but just run with me for a second. It's possible that after Eriksson's indictment for financial crimes, his assets were frozen or put on a tight watch. He might have even been barred from making certain moves with his money. Now, let's say he invests in a company his friend owns. That company is then acquired by another one in a completely different jurisdiction. Here's another piece of the puzzle. Floor had an over-the-counter stock listing. These are publicly traded companies who aren't worth enough to be listed on the major indexes like the Nasdaq. Their shares are typically valued at under $1 each, which is why they're also called penny stocks. One interesting thing about penny stocks is that they're not regulated like at all. Most traders with any sense at all avoid dealing with them because they are infested with scams. Hey, you remember all those NFT and crypto frauds that we were seeing around 2021 and 22? The exact same tactics are tried and true there. So, let's say you own a flooring company and you use your new acquisition to boost the value of your crappy little stock. You get a bunch of people on board, sell off a bunch of shares, and get a quick injection of capital. And if you're a guy who happens to have his assets under close watch by your government, you've now replaced your old dirty money with completely new, clean money. Plus, extra, maybe. That's why it's called money laundering. Not that that actually happened, though. In fact, this has nothing to do with the story, and I don't even know why I mentioned it. With their newfound legitimate venture, Eriksson and Freer would set to work on their next scheme. Floor Decor would be transformed into a tech startup, Tiger Telematics. They were going into the electronics business, but to do that, they'd need some help. In walks Michael Carrender. Carrender belonged to a group known as the End Timers. Based in Lake City, Florida, the End Timers were a hyper-conservative doomsday cult formed by a man named Charles Meade. They were an exclusionary group who focused on shunning outside culture and growing their population with arranged teen marriages. They controlled a number of businesses in and around Lake City, and all of their money went through the Central Church, making it very difficult for organizations like the FBI to tell if there was anything illegal going on. Carrender was made executive VP of Floor Decor for only 4 months in 2002 before it became Tiger Telematics, and he the CEO. It's unknown how they met him, why they decided he was CEO material, or why he decided to join a company outside of the church. The first product from the newly formed Tiger Telematics would leverage their history in the GPS business. A very common service is to provide GPS units to companies for tracking things like goods or fleet vehicles. Tiger decided to start work on a device to be given to children. Yeah, the idea was to sell it to parents so that they could keep track of their kids. And these guys, who have a history with organized crime and at least brushed with the world of human trafficking, would have access to the location of hundreds, if not thousands, of children. Okay, there was a problem with this, however. Kids don't want to carry around a tracking bug. If only they knew what was to come. The solution? Make it a game console. Initially called the Game Track, creepy title, alright, the Gizmondo was a janky Frankenstein of a handheld. There's a kind of hilarious offhandedness to the phrase, let's just do a video game console, because it turns a relatively simple device into a much more complex one with a lot of different challenges. I get the impression that the extremely light amount of research and development led them to focus on the simplest, easiest parts of the product. Yeah, if you throw some engineers in a room and give them a feature set with vague limitations on scope, they can come up with a box that fits all that stuff inside. The audience is looking for software, and that's the hard part, because, making games is hard, and you need a lot of them. The big three of home consoles either got in early or had tons of capital to throw at building up a library. Which leads me to wonder, why a game console? I mean, it adds on such a huge commitment to a product that should have been straightforward. Did they not understand the risks? Was there some ulterior motive? I don't think we'll ever know, but the amount of publicity they drummed up for the company was enough to get journalists to start asking some different questions. For instance, Gizmondo paid a developer called Northern Lights $3.5 million to develop software for the system. That's a lot for a company you've definitely never heard of. Well, wouldn't you know it, who owns half of Northern Lights stock? Freer and Eriksson. There's too many examples like this to list them all, but there's all the classics. Spouses in executive positions getting huge bonuses, the company bank account being used to buy expensive cars, that kind of thing. A lot of the businesses they made deals with, they actually owned in some part or had a connection to, and the ones they didn't, they'd run a little scheme called a stock swap. Essentially, we make a deal where you do something for me, and I pay you $500. Except I don't actually pay you in money, I pay you in $500 worth of my company's stock. If you love gambling, this is awesome.
Cool.
Because if the value of the shares go up, you get to sell them for, I don't know, $1,000. Or they could drop to nothing and you did $500 worth of work for pennies. But why worry about that when the Gizmondo is going to be a surefire hit? I mean, look at all these celebrities at their parties. Their weird ad with the bumblebee. All the tech guys are saying this is the next big thing. It was abysmal. Exact sales figures are unknown, but in the entire year of 2005, they sold, at most, 5,000 units in Europe. Compare this to the multi-millions spent elsewhere, and despite what they may have claimed about this being a limited release, it was a complete failure. Confusingly, Gizmondo units weren't sold in traditional brick and mortar stores like GameStop, rather exclusively at mall kiosks, so if you didn't have one nearby, you didn't have an easy way to get your hands on one. There was also the Gizmondo store in London, so I guess you could have gone there. That limited availability on top of the mountain of other factors made sure this thing was dead in the water. The US release went just as poorly, and you know what that means. Creditors want blood. They were pounding on every door. Gizmondo was late on payments to the PR firm Ogilvy, MTV Europe, the Jordan F1 racing team, their UK landlords. They bought a horse? It was a racehorse named Gizmondo. It competed for 5 years and it actually won money. The most profitable thing about this company was the fucking horse. This was looking bad enough, but Carrender woke up one morning, a week before the US release, to find out he was going to have to weather this storm alone. Eriksson and Freer had resigned. Bewildered, he tries to get a straight answer out of them. Why were they leaving now? But the only thing they said was, there's an article coming out. On October 24th, 2005, the Swedish tabloid Aftonbladet ran a story. They'd received a tip that Stefan Eriksson, the high-profile tech entrepreneur in America, was the same Stefan Eriksson who once terrorized Uppsala as the head of organized crime. The two of them needed to lay low for a bit and fled to LA. Just a few months later, in January of 2006, Gizmondo Europe filed for bankruptcy. Carrender was left holding the bag, and I think that was the backup plan the whole time. If I had to guess, Carrender wasn't in the inner circle of the cabal. It's known that he didn't take the absurd bonuses that the others did, and he didn't have existing connections to companies they made deals with. He was just a face. That is an important part of an operation like this. You need someone who's high up but doesn't know 100% of what's going on. That way, there's someone with plausible deniability to clean up after you. And indeed, all he had to say for himself was, the Gizmondo was actually made and did operate. Don't think the Swedes laid low for too long, however. Shortly after escaping to LA, they kickstarted another tech scheme, much like the first one. But this time, they weren't going to challenge a bunch of giants in a highly competitive industry they knew nothing about. They would go head-to-head with the Verizons and T-Mobiles of the world. That's right, a wireless cell phone service called Zero Mobile. Second verse, same as the first. They pulled the same pump and dump, merging two squat little companies together to boost the share value, then selling off their stock to fund the new venture. For many, a failure as hard as the Gizmondo would be a dead stop in their career, but to Eriksson, it was nothing but a speed bump. He'd been through this song and dance before, and he was already set to get behind the wheel again. This time, he'd crank the gas higher and take it faster, 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 faster. On February 21st, 2006, Stefan Eriksson was traveling 194 miles per hour in his red Ferrari Enzo at 6 a.m. Eriksson had cocaine and alcohol in his system, speeding down a straightaway on the Malibu highway when he must have swerved and hit a telephone pole sideways. The force of the crash bisected the million-dollar car and left a path of debris for 1,200 feet. After Eriksson's story about a mysterious, non-existent driver who had fled into the hills, police were already digging into the details. As it turns out, the car wasn't street legal. It didn't have the proper paperwork and still had European license plates. The reason for this was simple, but invited even more questions. The car didn't belong to Eriksson. It was owned by Capital Bank in Scotland and was being leased to him. News of the crash took them by surprise. He was behind on his payments, but they hadn't marked the vehicle as missing because they assumed it was still in the United Kingdom. Another call, another bank. Lombard from the UK had also leased him a black Enzo, which was also missing. A third call, a third bank. Guess what? There's a Mercedes-Benz SLR McLaren that no one can find. This coincided with yet another mystery. Why did Eriksson, who wasn't even a US citizen, have a police badge? What did he mean he was part of an anti-terrorism unit? Why did his associate leave a fully loaded magazine under the front seat of a stranger's car? Investigators soon unraveled a bizarre set of circumstances. In the sleepy town of San Gabriel, near Los Angeles, a man named Yosef Maiwandi had started up a private bus service known as the San Gabriel Valley Transit Authority. This was a company that claimed to primarily serve disabled people in the area, but it had a strange twist. Maiwandi had exploited an obscure statute in California law to form his own police force. This might sound weird, but the law's primary purpose was for colleges. See, a university has so many people that it's kind of like its own town, so they're able to form local police departments that are still considered part of law enforcement. By claiming his private company was a public institution, he had his own department that was allowed to wear uniforms, carry badges, and order weapons. He claimed that this was for the purpose of doing, quote-unquote, background checks. At some point, Eriksson approached Maiwandi and made him a deal. He would install cameras and facial recognition software on the company's buses in exchange for being named Deputy Commissioner of the Police Department. This means that Stefan Eriksson, a mob boss who was able to transport large, expensive items in and out of the country, post 9/11 mind you, now had unchecked access to guns and ammunition. You know who else was a member of the San Gabriel Valley Transit Authority Police Department? Or the SGVTAPD? Yep, Carl Freer! All of these factors were understandably pretty alarming to investigators. A warrant was issued and Freer's yacht and Bel Air home were raided by authorities. Inside, they found 12 rifles and 4 handguns, all obtained without background checks, of course. Eriksson attempted to flee the country back to the UK, but was intercepted by police before he could leave. His home, also in Bel Air, was torn apart. Curiously, they discovered a Magnum revolver in the house, but it didn't belong to Eriksson. Instead, a man named Roger Davis. Davis was a local realtor who had been given the position of reserve deputy after donating to Sheriff Michael Corona's campaign. Not only this, Davis was the president of Zero Mobile. Eriksson's trial was surprisingly short, lasting only a few months. Initially, the Los Angeles jury who tried him couldn't reach a unanimous vote, and it went to a mistrial. Capitalizing on the opportunity, Eriksson's lawyers arranged a plea deal for him. He pled guilty to 2 counts of embezzlement and 1 count of illegal gun possession. Because he never went to another trial, he avoided a grand theft auto charge. Just like the days back in Sweden, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison, but only served a little over 1. Once released in 2008, he was deported back to his home country, where he was immediately arrested for charges that had been lingering since he left, namely pouring gasoline on one of his debtors. He only served 18 months and has kept a low profile since then. Nothing really happened to Karl Freer. He was never charged with illegal gun possession, as he was able to prove all his firearms were legal and registered under his name. He began working to repair his image, even claiming that he was going to reboot the Gizmondo brand. This never happened, and he instead went on to found a number of companies in the biotech industry. He was involved in some criminal scandals, however, namely his association with the Danish fraudster Stein Bagger. That guy sounds like a Looney Tune of a Danish criminal. He also caught an allegation of racketeering related to one of his startups, Get Fugu, but that failed and he actually countersued successfully. Nowadays, he has 3 patents to his name, 1 for treating RNA viruses, 1 for diagnosing coronavirus variants, and 1 for burn treatment bandages. Michael Carrender is nowhere to be found. He stopped giving interviews after 2006, but he does drop an interesting side of the story. According to Carrender, Eriksson was brought on by Freer specifically to connect them to high-profile racing brands for promotion. Any background checks revealed nothing about his extensive criminal history. Carrender himself served no time for his trouble, and as far as I can tell, just disappeared into obscurity, perhaps back into the arms of his church community. No drugs, no guns, no sports cars or fraud. Somehow, the doomsday cultist from Florida was the most normal guy in the whole story. Tiger Telematics' corpse was harder to sift through than the Ferraris. For one, the company itself was a potpourri of acquisitions and subsidiaries split across different continents and accounts. Their finances were intentionally labyrinthine, and by the time liquidators got to the end of it, they were short about $382.5 million. Tiger reported them as losses, but they couldn't figure out where even half of that money had gone. It just vanished into thin air. After the car crash, an onlooker salvaged a 40-centimeter long hose from the site and auctioned it on eBay. It reached $152 before the listing was taken down by the site. I assume that Capital Bank seized the wreckage and donated it back to Ferrari because it was rebuilt and put on auction in 2016. Gizmondo, the console, would never see the light of day again, forever remembered as an out-of-touch failure. Gizmondo, the horse, would compete in 26 races with a total of 4 top 3 showings. What I find so funny about the Gizmondo is that they were so close to a good idea and they just veered straight off a cliff. Or into a pole, if you will. The iPhone would launch only a year later after the Gizmondo, and I joked about it earlier, but their original plan for a child tracking device would manifest in the form of a number of smartphone services. If they had just played it a little slower, had a bit of patience, they could have been right there to capitalize on the fresh market of the App Store. But it wasn't to be. In the criminal world, Eriksson is a common character, a gangster who has something to prove, who subverts the law to show that he can, and is willing to do brutal things to maintain his image. Some would say that his ego was what sank him, but I think the scarier reading is that it's the one thing that kept him afloat all these years. As far as I can tell, he remains in Sweden to this day, doing who knows what, but he did catch a charge for drug possession back in 2014. In his homeland, there would be both a 2015 play and a 2019 documentary series about his life, both named Jokstefe, or Fat Steve, his nickname from prison. What do you think of the Gizmondo? What about Eriksson, Freer, Carrender? And if any of them are watching right now, I want to let you guys know that any claim made in the comments section has the prefix allegedly. Thanks to my patrons who keep this channel free. Let's see if I can get to 10K before I die, and check out my podcast. Bye.
Here comes a daredevil. Game over!